I'm going to come back to this point and develop it at considerable length in the second hour of my lecture. I just want you to notice that for the time being. So I'm trying to point out then that when I talk about increased standard of living, increased income, there are enormous consequences, such as the doubling of life expectancy. What else happens as countries become richer? Anything else? Well, now here's another big thing. Women, if I may use a term from the 1960s or 70s, become liberated. It's something that did not exist in periods or in places where there is low economic development, but does exist in places and in periods where there is high economic development. Now, what do I mean by this when I say women become liberated? I mean that women start taking jobs in the paid labor force. They are no longer stuck doing unpaid domestic labor at home. I mean that women in large numbers get a higher education, something that in less developed countries they tend not to do. These are huge changes. Women tend to get control over their own reproduction. That is to say, through the development and use of contraception, they are able to control how many children they have, when they have those children, and the spacing between children, so that they can sort of organize things to suit their career plans and their educational plans. A higher and higher proportion, and this is a general trend, of course, there are exceptions, I'll talk about them in a minute. As countries become richer, a higher and higher proportion of political representatives are females. In some countries, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, we now have a situation where half the people sitting in parliament are women. In Canada, it's about a quarter. But some countries have gotten to the point where they are represented in proportion to their size of the population. So all of these things happen. Women become liberated in the sense that they start becoming highly educated, active in the paid labor force, and become active politically, and so on and so forth. In fact, a few years ago, I did a study with a few students. We analyzed data from the World Health Organization and the United Nations and the World Bank and a few other sources in order to try to figure out which countries of the world had experienced the biggest declines in gender inequality and which factors accounted for that decline. And I want to tell you very briefly about what we found, because I think it's of some interest. First of all, just 2 slides on this. First of all, we used as indicators of gender inequality 4 different variables, which I've listed here. We looked at the ratio of males to females in primary schools, secondary schools, and post-secondary schools, that is tertiary educational institutions, colleges and universities. That's an indicator of gender inequality, insofar as the higher the ratio, that is, the more males relative to females, the higher the level of gender inequality. And conversely, the lower that ratio, the lower the level of gender inequality. Second factor, men as a percent of elected parliamentarians in the lower house of Parliament. The lower house is where the laws are made. Upper houses, like senates, tend in many countries just to be ceremonial or have less power, as in Canada. In any event, men as a percent of parliamentarians. Again, the higher that ratio, the greater the inequality between women and men. The third was participation of women in the paid labor force, the rate of participation. What proportion of women over the age of 15 worked for money in the paid labor force? Again, the lower the rate of female participation in the paid labor force, the higher the level of gender inequality. And finally, you may recall that in an early lecture, I think the second lecture, I was talking about this phenomenon of female genital mutilation. We used the rate of female genital mutilation as an indicator of gender inequality, arguing with data from the World Health Organization that the higher the prevalence of female genital mutilation, the higher the level of gender inequality, because it suggests a particular form of oppression of women. And we combine these indicators of gender inequality into a single index, and we then measured for the magnitude of this index for every country in the world. Actually, we were only able to get data on 147 of the world's approximately 210 countries. So we had to work with 147 countries. And we found the following. Okay, we found three factors that account for most of the variation in gender inequality in the world. Remember, we're looking at the characteristics of countries. The number one factor was gross domestic product per capita. That is to say, how wealthy the country was. The wealthier the country, the less the gender inequality. There was a negative correlation between these. The higher the wealthier the country, the less the gender inequality. Why does that take place? Well, in order for countries to become really rich, they have to mobilize everyone, or almost everyone, to work in the paid labor force. This is what's happened in Canada since the 1960s in particular, or since the 1950s. In the 1950s, women tended to work, to do domestic labor in the home. Of course, there were some exceptions, for unmarried women particularly, but that was largely the story. Over the past 60 years or so, the great majority of women have come to work in the paid labor force. And we have increased our income as a result, because families now tend to have two incomes, not one. So that's one of the things that happens. And in order for women to enter the paid labor force, they also have to receive higher education. Otherwise, they won't have the skills necessary to perform high-level tasks and make money to contribute to family income. So, in other words, it's necessary for countries that want to develop economically to mobilize women. So that's number one factor. I should also say, well, I'll say this in a minute. That's the number one factor we found. Here's the second factor. And I know that it's going to be a sensitive issue with some of you, but once I explain it in context, I think it will be less so. Percent Muslim. We discovered that the second most important factor determining gender inequality was the percent of a country that is Muslim. What does this mean? I'm not talking here about doctrine. I'm not talking about religious beliefs. I am suggesting, and we suggested in the paper that we wrote, that what has happened is that in some countries in which there is a very large proportion of Muslims, it is the policy of people in positions of authority and power to ensure that women cannot participate in politics, cannot work in the paid labor force, and cannot get a higher education or even a secondary or primary education. An example of that many of you will know is Afghanistan, where we have cases, for example, of little girls trying to go to school and opponents of female education throwing acid in their face in order to teach all girls that this is something they should not do. The people who do this say they represent a particular body of thought and doctrine. Obviously, there are wide variations in the degree to which people adhere to these principles. But in some places of the world, percent Muslim is associated with oppression of women. And we therefore find that percent Muslim is associated with gender inequality. The higher the proportion of Muslims, the lower the level of gender inequality as we measure it. There, of course, can be other measures, but in terms of those four indexes. And the third factor that we discovered was statistically significantly related to gender inequality was whether or not the country was a former communist country or was now a communist country at the time of the analysis. We found that countries that had been or were now defined as communist countries, in those countries, there was a tendency to have less gender inequality, because as a matter of policy, these countries tried to mobilize women in the paid labor force and in higher education and in politics in order to achieve rapid economic development. In the case of the Soviet Union, for instance, there was another important factor. After World War, Russia lost more people in World War II, or the Soviet Union, than any other country in the world. It lost tens of millions of people, most of them men. So if you look at the demographic balance between women and men in the Soviet Union in 1945-46, you find out there were a lot more women than men. And wanting to witness rapid economic development, the leaders of the country recognized that women simply had to be mobilized to get into higher education and the paid labor force and so on. So there was an attempt made by the rulers of the Soviet Union, which of course included Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Armenia and Georgia, all of those republics, to mobilize women into the paid labor force into higher education. And that was a legacy that's lasted until today. So each of these factors had an independent effect on gender inequality. What does that mean? It means that, for example, with per capita income, when you matched countries, you took countries that had about the same percentage of Muslims and were not ever communist, we found that the level of economic development still had an effect on gender inequality. Or if we took countries that were, looked at the relationship between percent Muslim and variation in gender inequality, and we matched countries in terms of economic development and whether or not they had a communist government at any point in their history, we also found that a percent Muslim accounted for some of the variation in gender inequality. That's what I mean when I say they had independent effects. And we were also able to rank order these effects and say that one factor was more important than the other. Factor 1, factor 2, and factor 3. So what do I conclude from this? I conclude that anybody interested in decreasing the level of gender inequality in the world should recognize, one, that economic development is the single factor that is most important in liberating women. But secondly, economic and political policy can also have an effect. That is, what people decide to do about the place of women in society. Some societies decide that women should be, must be, mobilized to participate in higher education. Other societies decide that they should not be. And it is those decisions that have an effect on inequality independent of economic growth. So I want you to understand that this story is not just a story of economics, it's a story also of politics. That there is change over time, and this change occurs because of economic growth and because of political decisions that are made by rulers of countries and those who support those rulers. In short, then, the story of economic development is not just a story about getting rich, it's a story about living longer, and it's also a story about women being liberated. Now I can jump ahead again. You'll recall that I went into this digression because I was talking about this gap that developed between 1750 and 1913 as the Industrial Revolution progressed. What happened during the Industrial Revolution that enabled some countries to leap ahead and others to stagnate was this. The countries that went through the Industrial Revolution, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Russia, Japan, and the United States, they were able to amass enormous wealth. Huge profits were made. And that wealth was used to establish powerful armies and navies. And those armies and navies traveled to the less developed parts of the world, where they subdued and then annexed or colonized the poor countries between the middle of the 18th century and the middle of the 20th century. The colonies were forced to become sources of raw materials, sources of cheap labor, sources of investment opportunities, and markets for the goods produced by the wealthy countries. Basically then, the colonizers, all of these Western countries that I mentioned, plus Japan, prevented industrialization in the poor countries and locked them into poverty. Let me give you a couple of examples. Conquering Europeans killed off 50 to 80% of native populations in North and South America. Why? Well, the Incas and the Aztecs in South America had a lot of gold. The Spanish wanted the gold. To get the gold, they had to kill most of the indigenous peoples of South America. The British wanted the resources of Newfoundland, the fish, the timber, the minerals, and so on. And so they completely annihilated the indigenous population of Newfoundland and Labrador. As a matter of fact, they even paid indigenous peoples in Nova Scotia to come over and help them do the job. Other people enslaved Africans in order to grow wealthy. Millions of slaves were brought over from Africa to North and South America. Half of them died in transit. That is to say, the conditions aboard slave vessels were so awful that half of them died of disease or for some other reason on the way. And it was a trade like you trade in any commodity, the trading slaves. There were things that you could buy in the way that you could buy a piece of cloth. And economic calculations were made about the profitability of this trade. There was one famous case where a slave ship full that had left Ghana and was going to the Caribbean area, it got caught in a big storm. The ship was in danger of capsizing, and the captain realized that in order to save the ship, he would have to get rid of some of the weight. And he had two cargoes. He had hemp on the ship to make rope, a lot of it from Africa, and he had slaves. And he sat down and he figured out that the hemp was worth more than the slaves. He threw all the slaves overboard, rescued the ship, and brought the hemp over. That's the way colonization worked. Some countries became rich at the expense of others, and they did so in the most brutal way imaginable. Let me give you a more extended example by talking a bit about one of the largest countries in the world, India. In the 19th century, India was the center of world textile production, not just in the state of Madras, which was famous for it, but in many other parts of the country as well. Britain colonized India. It, first of all, looted gold on a wide scale. It simply stole gold from wealthy Indians. And it used that money, it brought it back to Britain, and used it to help build up the British textile industry. Step two, after looting India of gold, was to place duties on imports of textiles into Britain. In other words, the British said, okay, we're going to build up our textile industry using Indian gold as the capital, and now we're going to put a tax on textiles coming from India to Britain. A duty, a tariff. That way, we'll make Indian textiles relatively expensive. It will protect our local manufacturers of textiles. And at the same time, because we control India, we're going to make sure there is no tax in India so that our textiles can be sent there. Get it? Taxation policy. High tax on Indian textiles into Britain, no tax or a very small tax on British textiles into India. Then, next step, step three, power looms begin to be introduced. But Britain imposes a special tax on the production of cotton fabrics in India. And that tax on power looms stifled the growth of steam mills and industrial production of textiles. Taxation policy by the colonizing power prevented the industrialization of the textile industry in India. So eventually what happens over a few decades of this kind of policy, after robbing the country of gold and after imposing these different kinds of taxes that I've mentioned, is the textile industry of India, which formerly employed an enormous proportion of the population, which made India the center of world textile production, was ruined. It was no longer possible for people to produce textiles that were marketable in England or any other place in the world. And people increasingly turned to agriculture. Of course, a large proportion of the population in India was already involved in farming, but now more and more people who had been involved in the textile industry were compelled to get involved in agriculture as well. But the story didn't end there, because the British, once it realized that so many millions of people were moving from textile production to agriculture, imposed a land tax on Indian farmers that kept the Indian peasants impoverished, indebted, and incapable of saving. You know, later modernization theorists would come around and say, look, these people, they're poor because they can't save. Well, the reason they can't save, or they couldn't save historically, is because they were taxed and had no mechanism which would allow them to save. They were taxed by colonizing powers. So British rule in India broke down the foundations of the pre-colonial economy, the textile industry. It stifled the growth of the industrial economy by putting taxes on looms and steam mills and so on. And by ruining the handicraft and village economy of this subcontinent, British policy effectively created those infamous slums of India's cities, which today teem with millions of starving paupers. That's the story that needs to be told about colonization and its effect, because with different variations, it was different in different places, in the Middle East, in South Africa, and so on. This is what happened in all of the less developed countries. There was only one major exception to this pattern in the entire world. China was not an exception. India was not an exception. These were colonized countries that suffered some version of the story that I've just told. What was that one exception? No. That's way in the future. Japan. Japan is the major exception. Why is Japan the major exception? It was considered much less valuable. What did Japan have to offer? It didn't have oil. It didn't have gold. It didn't have minerals. It didn't have any of the things that China or India or other major countries had. And so the Western powers basically left Japan alone. And Japan, therefore, in the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, was free to industrialize in a way that China, India, and other countries weren't. And it therefore stands out as the single major exception to the pattern I've sketched, and it's an exception precisely because it wasn't colonized. Now, remember what Hans Rosling, that Swedish demographer whose little film I showed you, remember what he pointed out, that things started changing after World War II with life expectancy. This is a very important point, because after World War II, most of the colonies in the world gained independence. I'm not going to talk about how it came about that they gained independence. Some of them engaged in wars against the colonizing power. A famous example is that of Algeria, for example, in the 1950s, engaged in war, an anti-colonial war against France. There were many such uprisings. That's one of the major ways that it became very expensive for colonial powers to maintain control over rebellious hinterlands, and that's one of the major reasons why the anti-colonial movements happened. But When that happened, when the countries of the so-called third world, when less developed countries gained their independence, according to this second theory that I've been developing here, dependency theory, the alternative to modernization theory, according to dependency theorists, whereas under colonialism there was exploitation by direct colonial rule, we impose the taxes. We put our army there to ensure that you do what we say. That's direct colonial rule. Whereas that existed before World War II. New mechanisms were put in place after World War II that achieved the same end, that still kept many, not all, but many of the poor countries poor. And according to dependency theorists, these new mechanisms were as follows. First of all, substantial foreign investment by rich countries. Second, support for authoritarian governments in less developed countries. And third, mounting debt. Let me just briefly tell you about each of these. First of all, in the post-World War II period, multinational corporations from Britain, the United States, France, and so on, invested quite heavily in many of the poor countries in order to extract raw materials cheaply, and in order to create a market for their manufactured goods. Now, in the process of doing this, they created some low-paying jobs, mostly low-paying jobs, in less developed countries. But they also created many high-paying jobs in the rich countries, where the raw materials were used to process manufactured goods. And then they sold the manufactured goods made in the rich countries back to the poor countries for a profit. So the poor countries of the world tended to become dependent on exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods manufactured in the West. But there was little domestic industrialization. So, in other words, that form of investment, investing in the production of raw materials in poor countries, kept these poor countries in a state of dependency and limited their industrialization. Second mechanism that was employed to keep poor countries, some, not all, but many, most, to keep them poor, was support for authoritarian governments. What happened in the World War II period was that Western countries and governments offered military support to local authoritarian governments. Local authoritarian governments managed to keep their populations quiet most of the time. When they couldn't, the West would step in with military help. Here's a famous example. Iran, 1953. Iran is a country awash in oil, even in the 1950s. People are beginning to recognize that it is potentially an enormously wealthy country. And the oil is taken out of the ground by a company that later became, it was called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It's now called BP, British Petroleum. I'm sure you've heard about it, BP, one of the biggest companies in the world. And things were going along swimmingly until 1953, because then an election was held in which a guy was elected. It was a democratic election. And he said, you know what? It's our oil. The British are taking this out of here for $2 a barrel. We're getting almost nothing in the way of royalties. What we should do is take control of our own oil fields. We can thereby get a higher royalty on the sale of each barrel of oil, and we can use that money to build up industry in this country. We can develop economically. The fellow who headed the Iranian, democratically elected Iranian government at this time, his name was Mohammad Mossadegh, Mossadegh. Well, guess what? The British didn't like this. The British didn't like the possibility that they would lose their major source of oil. Nor did the Americans like it, because it would threaten the security of Europe. They weren't buying too much oil from Iran at this point, but their allies of Europe, they didn't like it. So the British intelligence service, MI5, together with the CIA,